I thought kidnapping the senator's brilliant son would break his empire. I expected him to beg for his life. Instead, he looked at my blade, smirked, and whispered, "My father won't pay a dime. But if you give me a laptop, I'll help you burn him to the ground." The scent of damp concrete and metallic tang was a familiar prelude to violence, but Julian Vance had expected it to smell less like an expensive, single-malt scotch. He woke up slowly, his senses piecing together the reality of his situation before he even opened his eyes. Hands tied behind a heavy oak chair. Ankles bound tightly to the legs. A dull ache pulsing at the base of his skull, the calling card of a professionally delivered blow. He didn't panic. Panic was a waste of glucose, and Julian prided himself on absolute efficiency. "He's awake, boss." The voice was gruff, local, the unmistakable cadence of a low-level enforcer. Julian opened his eyes, blinking against the harsh glare of a single overhead bulb. The room was a sprawling, subterranean basement, but it lacked the chaotic filth of a standard cartel safehouse. It was meticulously kept. At the edge of the light stood a man who didn't fit the profile of a common thug. Dante Alighieri. No, Dante Vance would have been an irony, but this was Dante Romano. The undisputed king of the city's underground, a man whose family had been systematically bled dry by Julian's own father, Senator Anthony Vance. Dante stood over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that looked entirely too elegant for a kidnapping. His dark hair was clipped short, and his eyes, a striking, cold amber, held the kind of quiet fury that usually preceded a funeral. "Julian Vance," Dante said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the damp air. He stepped into the light, holding a silver-plated scalpel between his fingers. The golden boy. The prodigy. The only piece of Anthony Vance's legacy that he actually seems to value. "Value is a subjective term," Julian replied, his voice remarkably steady despite the dry scrape in his throat. He looked directly into Dante's amber eyes. "If you think my father is currently losing sleep, you drastically misunderstand the sociopathy of the Senate Appropriations Committee." Dante paused, the scalpel halting an inch from Julian's cheek. A slight, dangerous smile tugged at the corner of the Mafia boss's mouth. "You're either incredibly brave, or you don't realize that I am going to peel the skin from your fingers until your father hands over the offshore routing numbers." "He won't," Julian said flatly. "He'll use my abduction to pass the new anti-racketeering bill, claim a tax write-off on my life insurance, and replace me with his chief of staff by Monday. If you cut me, you're just wasting perfectly good linen." Dante leaned in, the scent of cedarwood and expensive tobacco washing over Julian. Up close, the intensity of the man was suffocating. There was a raw, primal magnetism to him, a sharp contrast to the soft, bloated politicians Julian had spent his life around. Dante pressed the flat of the blade against Julian's jawline. It was icy cold. "You're bargaining for your life with a silver tongue, politician's son," Dante whispered, his breath warm against Julian's ear. "Give me one reason I shouldn't find out what color your blood is." "Because I hate him more than you do," Julian whispered back, refusing to flinch. "And unlike you, I know exactly where the foundations of his empire are buried. You want to bleed him financially. I want to erase him from existence. Let's talk terms." Dante stared at him, searching the calm, crystalline depths of Julian's eyes for a tremor of fear. Finding none, he slowly stepped back, flipping the scalpel in his hand. "You have 5 minutes," Dante said, pulling up a chair directly opposite Julian, sitting down with a dark, predatory grace. "Amuse me." Julian took a slow breath, adjusting to the sudden shift in gravity. The physical threat hadn't vanished, but the playing field had leveled. He was no longer a hostage, he was a consultant in a room full of wolves. "My father's empire doesn't run on political favor, Mr. Romano. It runs on a dual-ledger system routed through the maritime shipping lanes in the North Harbor," Julian began, his voice taking on the crisp, analytical tone he used when dissecting corporate acquisitions. "You've been hitting his supply trucks. That's a mistake. It's a superficial flesh wound. He insures the cargo at 150% of its street value. Every time you hijack a truck, you're actually making him richer. Dante's amber eyes narrowed. A tense silence descended on the basement. The enforcer in the corner shifted uncomfortably, but Dante raised a single, leather-gloved hand to keep him silent. Go on, Dante commanded. The real nerve center is the Genesis Foundation, a shell charity registered in Luxembourg, Julian continued, leaning forward as much as his bonds allowed. It handles the bribery payouts for the entire state legislature. I wrote the encryption algorithm for it when I was 19. I can dismantle it in 48 hours. But I need a terminal, a secure proxy, and your word that when Anthony Vance falls, I am the one who pulls the rug. Dante leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The proximity was electric. For a moment, the criminal underworld and the political dynasty faded away, leaving only the raw, magnetic pull between two men who recognized the same dark ambition in each other. And what do you want in exchange for betraying your own blood, Julian? Dante asked softly, his gaze dropping momentarily to Julian's lips before locking back onto his eyes. Protection. Total immunity from your operations. And a front-row seat to his ruin, Julian said, a rare, genuine spark of malice igniting in his eyes. I am not my father's son. I am his worst mistake. Let me be your strategist, Dante. I will give you the city on a silver platter, and all it will cost you is a room, a laptop, and a temporary truce. Dante stood up slowly, walks around the back of Julian's chair. Julian felt the sudden, sharp slice of the scalpel, not against his skin, but against the ropes binding his wrists. The tension snapped. Julian brought his hands forward, rubbing his chafed wrists, looking up as Dante offered him a hand to stand. Julian took it. Dante's grip was warm, crushing, and entirely possessive. He pulled Julian up a little too close, their chests almost touching. If you are lying to me, Julian Vance, Dante murmured, his voice a low promise that sent a strange, thrilling shiver down Julian's spine, I won't just kill you. I will make you regret ever being born. I already regret being born a Vance, Julian replied, looking up at the Mafia boss with a defiant, breathless smirk. You'll find I'm remarkably loyal to my own survival. Dante stared at him for a long, heavy beat, before turning to his enforcer. Take him to the guest suite on the 3rd floor. Give him whatever he asks for. He belongs to me now. The guest suite on the 3rd floor of the Romano estate was less of a prison and more of a gilded cage. High ceilings, heavy velvet drapes, and a massive mahogany desk equipped with a state-of-the-art terminal awaited Julian. It was clear Dante didn't do things by halves. If Julian was to be his weapon, he would be kept sharp and well-oiled. Julian sat at the desk, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, rhythmic precision. The blue glow of the monitor illuminated the sharp lines of his face. He had spent the last 6 hours bypassing the primary firewalls of the Genesis Foundation. It was a beautiful, twisted piece of financial architecture, one he had built for his father under duress years ago, and one he was now thoroughly enjoying burning to the ground. A soft click at the door broke his concentration. Dante walked in, having discarded his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms covered in intricate, dark tattoos that snaked up from his wrists. He carried a crystal tumbler of scotch and a plate of untouched food. You haven't eaten, Dante observed, setting the plate next to the keyboard. He leaned against the edge of the desk, dangerously close, looking down at the cascading lines of code on the screen. My men tell me you haven't left this chair since morning. Eating slows down cognitive processing, Julian said without looking up, though his pulse spiked slightly at Dante's proximity. The scent of wood smoke and expensive cologne followed the Mafia boss like a shadow. And I'm at a critical juncture. Look here. Julian pointed to a specific node on the display. Dante leaned in, his shoulder brushing against Julian's. The heat radiating from the older man was distracting, but Julian forced his focus onto the screen. "This is the Legislative Slush Fund," Julian explained, his voice low and intense. "Every month, $5 million moves from the North Harbor shipping accounts into this blind trust. From there, it's distributed to 12 key senators to keep your family's territories heavily policed while my father's operations get a free pass. I'm rerouting the next transfer." Dante raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "Where to?" "To a numbered account held by the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division, disguised as an anonymous whistleblower deposit," Julian said, a cold, brilliant smile cutting across his face. "By tomorrow morning, 12 of your biggest political headaches are going to receive automated flags for undeclared foreign income. They'll be too busy hiring defense lawyers to worry about your territory." Dante stared at the screen, then looked down at Julian. The sheer brilliance of the man sitting in front of him was intoxicating. Dante had expected a pampered politician's son; instead, he had captured a beautiful, lethal architect of ruin. Dante reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping Julian's jaw, forcing the younger man to look up at him. Julian gasped softly at the sudden touch, his breath hitching. Dante's thumb stroked the line of Julian's cheekbone, surprisingly gentle for a man who killed for a living. "You are a terrifying creature, Julian," Dante murmured, his amber eyes burning with a mixture of fascination and something much darker. "A beautiful, brilliant snake." "I told you," Julian whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs, his body leaning into the warmth of Dante's hand despite his mind screaming to maintain distance. "I want him destroyed. If that makes me a snake, so be it." Dante's gaze dropped to Julian's lips, the tension in the room stretching so tight it felt ready to snap. Slowly, deliberately, Dante pulled his hand away, though his eyes never left Julian's. "Eat the food, Julian," Dante commanded softly, his voice a low growl. "I need my strategist alive and well. The war is just beginning." 3 days into his captivity, Julian had effectively crippled his father's legislative shield. The local news was a circus of political scandals, with Senator Vance's closest allies publicly scrambling to explain their sudden financial discrepancies. But Julian knew his father. Anthony Vance wouldn't panic, he would retaliate. He would look for the leak, and eventually, the trail would lead to the realization that his kidnapped son wasn't a victim, but the mastermind. To clear his head, Julian had ventured out of his room, walking down the sweeping grand staircase of the Romano mansion. He found Dante in the private gymnasium on the ground floor. The Mafia boss was bare-chested, his body a canvas of scars and ink, violently hitting a heavy leather punching bag. Every strike landed with the force of a car crash, sweat glistening on his broad shoulders and the deep ridges of his back. Julian stopped in the doorway, momentarily paralyzed by the sheer, raw physicality of the sight. He was used to men who fought with pens and backroom deals; Dante fought with his bare hands and absolute, unyielding power. Dante caught sight of Julian in the reflection of the wall mirrors. He stopped, catching the heavy bag with one arm, his chest heaving as he wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Am I distracting you, strategist?" Dante asked, a teasing, dangerous smirk playing on his lips. "Hardly," Julian lied smoothly, crossing his arms and leaning against the doorframe, though his eyes lingered on the line of Dante's V-shaped torso. "I came to warn you. My father has just authorized an emergency audit of the North Harbor Dockworkers Union. He knows the leak came from his internal system, and he's trying to choke off the physical route where your family intercepts his shipments." Dante grabbed a towel, wiping himself down as he walked slowly toward Julian. The predatory grace in his stride made Julian's posture stiffen, a thrilling jolt of adrenaline shooting through his veins. "Let him try," Dante said, stopping just inches from Julian. He smelled of sweat and iron, a heady, intoxicating combination that made Julian's head spin. "The docks are mine. He can send his federal lackeys, but they won't find a thing without my permission." "You're being arrogant," Julian countered, his eyes snapping to Dante's. He didn't back down, stepping closer until their chests were almost touching. He's not sending auditors to find paperwork, Dante. He's sending them to plant evidence. He's going to frame your captains for federal smuggling to force a military lockdown of the harbor. Dante's smirk vanished, replaced by a dark, intense focus. He leaned down, his face a breath away from Julian's. And how do we stop it? We don't stop it. We let them plant it, Julian whispered, his gaze shifting between Dante's intense amber eyes and his mouth. Then, we tip off the rival news network 3 hours before the raid, showing the federal agents actually placing the contraband. We turn his own trap into a public execution of his credibility. Dante let out a low, rough laugh, a sound that vibrated straight through Julian's chest. You are ruthless, sweetheart. The casual pet name made Julian's breath hitch. Before he could reply, Dante's hand locked around the back of Julian's neck, pulling him forward. It wasn't a violent gesture, but it was entirely unyielding. For a second, Julian thought Dante was going to kiss him, and his body practically arched into the possibility. Instead, Dante leaned in, brushing his lips against Julian's earlobe. Play this card right, Julian, and I might just have to make you a permanent fixture by my side. Not as a prisoner. As my king. Dante pulled back, giving Julian a long, burning look before walking past him out of the gym, leaving the young strategist standing in the doorway, breathless and utterly consumed by a fire he hadn't planned for. The media fallout from the North Harbor sting was a masterpiece of public humiliation. Video footage of federal agents planting crates of illegal contraband on a Romano-owned dock played on a continuous loop across every major news network. By noon, Julian's father was forced to issue a strained, stone-faced press conference condemning rogue elements within the department, his political capital evaporating in real time. Inside the quiet sanctuary of Dante's study, however, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. Julian sat on the edge of the leather sofa, a map of the city's financial district spread across the coffee table. Dante stood behind him, one hand resting on the back of the sofa, leaning over Julian's shoulder to study the red ink markings. The scent of Dante's expensive tobacco and dark rum enveloped Julian like a physical weight, making it increasingly difficult to focus on the numbers. He's backed into a corner, Julian said, his voice slightly tighter than usual. Anthony is bleeding money, and his public approval is in the gutter. When a man like him loses his legal shields, he resorts to his illegal ones. He's going to call in his markers with the Ironborn Syndicate. The Ironborn are mercenaries, Dante murmured, his breath brushing against the nape of Julian's neck, sending a sharp, electric shiver straight down the strategist's spine. They don't care about politics. They only care about who pays them. Exactly. And my father can still pay them using his off-the-books real estate holdings in the West End. Julian turned his head slightly to look at Dante, only to realize just how close they were. Their faces were mere inches apart. Julian's eyes locked onto Dante's mouth before darting back to his amber eyes. If we seize those properties, we starve him out completely. Dante didn't look at the map. His intense, burning gaze was fixed entirely on Julian's lips. Slowly, he reached out, his gloved fingers tracing the line of Julian's collarbone, pushing the silk shirt aside just enough to expose the pale skin beneath. You've given me everything I asked for, Julian, Dante whispered, his voice a low, seductive rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. You've torn down a senator's empire in less than a week. Tell me, what is it you really want? Just revenge? Or is there something else you're looking for in my house? Julian's breath hitched. He felt completely exposed under Dante's predatory gaze, yet he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, his own hand rising to grip Dante's wrist. I want freedom, Dante. And I want a partner who doesn't flinch at the dark. Dante's eyes darkened, a flash of pure possessiveness crossing his features. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against Julian's jawline, making the younger man gasp softly. I don't flinch, sweetheart. I conquer. Before the moment could consume them, the heavy double doors of the study burst open. Marco, Dante's right-hand man, stepped in, his face pale. "Boss, we have a problem. The West End vault just went dark. We think your father's men didn't wait for the Ironborn, they've already moved on the assets." Dante straightened up instantly, his demeanor shifting from a seductive predator to a ruthless commander in a split second. He let go of Julian, though his eyes lingered on him for a final, burning moment. "Get the cars. Julian, you're coming with me. It's time to see your strategy in action." The rain was pouring in sheets by the time they reached the West End Industrial Park. The abandoned textile mill served as the physical vault for Anthony Vance's liquid assets, millions in bearer bonds and diamonds. Dante's men moved with silent efficiency, breaching the perimeter walls. Julian remained in the back of the reinforced SUV, watching the security feeds on his laptop. But Julian wasn't just observing, his pulse was racing, a toxic mix of adrenaline and an entirely new, visceral fear for the man currently leading the charge into the dark. Suddenly, the feed cut to static. Gunfire echoed through the rainy night, a sharp, deafening cacophony that made Julian's heart violently hammer against his ribs. "Dante," Julian muttered, gripping the edges of his laptop. Ignoring his own rule of absolute self-preservation, Julian threw open the SUV door and stepped into the freezing rain, running toward the entrance of the mill. Inside, the air was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and copper. Several of his father's mercenaries lay incapacitated on the concrete floor. At the center of the room, under a flickering industrial light, Dante was locked in hand-to-hand combat with a massive Ironborn enforcer. The enforcer swung a heavy iron pipe, catching Dante across the shoulder. Dante grunted, stumbling back, a smear of blood cutting across his cheek. Seeing Dante hurt ignited a cold, blinding fury inside Julian. Without thinking, Julian grabbed a discarded iron crowbar from a nearby crate. As the enforcer moved in to deliver a finishing blow to Dante, Julian lunged forward, swinging the crowbar with all his might against the back of the enforcer's knee. The man roared in pain, collapsing to one knee. That split-second distraction was all Dante needed. With a terrifying, fluid grace, Dante stepped inside the man's guard, delivering a devastating combination that knocked the enforcer unconscious against the concrete. Silence fell over the warehouse, save for the sound of heavy breathing and the steady drip of rain through the broken roof. Dante turned slowly, his chest heaving, blood dripping down his sharp jawline. He stared at Julian, who was still holding the crowbar, his breathing ragged, his pristine white shirt soaked in rain and flecked with the enforcer's blood. "You came out of the car," Dante said, his voice incredibly low, dangerously soft as he walked toward Julian. "You were losing your leverage," Julian lied breathlessly, his hands trembling slightly as he dropped the crowbar. "I couldn't let my investment die." Dante stopped right in front of him. Without a word, he grabbed Julian by the waist and slammed him gently but firmly against a steel structural pillar. Julian let out a soft gasp as Dante's hands locked onto his hips, pinning him. "You're a liar," Dante growled softly, his amber eyes wild with adrenaline and unadulterated desire. "You came for me. And if I did?" Julian challenged, looking up into the face of the Mafia boss, his heart pounding erratically. Dante didn't answer with words. He leaned down and captured Julian's lips in a fierce, bruising kiss. It tasted of copper, rain, and absolute, consuming passion. Julian let out a broken sigh, his arms wrapping tightly around Dante's neck, pulling him closer, completely surrendering to the chaotic, beautiful madness of the man who had stolen him from his old life. Dante's hands traveled up Julian's back, lifting him slightly, deepening the kiss until Julian was entirely breathless, his mind spinning into a void where only Dante existed. When Dante finally pulled back, his forehead rested against Julian's, his thumb gently wiping a stray drop of rain from Julian's lip. "You're mine now, Julian," Dante whispered, a fierce vow echoing through the empty mill. "Your father can send an army. I'm never letting you go." Julian smiled through his ragged breaths, his fingers tangling in Dante's damp hair. "Good. Because we're about to take his entire kingdom." The safe house smelled of ozone and damp earth, a stark contrast to the sterile, marble-lined halls Julian had grown up in. Following the firefight at the textile mill, Dante had moved their operations to a secure compound hidden beneath a defunct shipping yard on the river's edge. It was heavily fortified, but more importantly, it was completely invisible to his father's surveillance network. Julian sat at a steel table, a single lamp illuminating the sleek, black laptop before him. The bruise on his shoulder from the scuffle was a dull, throbbing ache, but his mind had never been sharper. The kiss in the rain had rewired something inside him, the clinical detachment he had used as a shield his entire life was fracturing, replaced by a fierce, protective focus centered entirely on the man currently pacing the perimeter of the room. Dante was restless. He had changed into a clean black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the dark ink of his tattoos. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift to Julian, an intense, possessive heat burning in their amber depths. "We have his liquid assets," Dante said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "The bearer bonds are being processed through my offshore accounts as we speak. But Anthony Vance isn't the type to fold because he's poor. He's the type to burn the house down to kill the rats. He doesn't know he's fighting rats, Dante. He thinks he's fighting you," Julian said, his fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern on the table. "He still believes I am a helpless hostage. He's currently drafting a federal emergency declaration, citing a Mafia-led domestic terror threat to bring the National Guard into your territories." Dante stopped pacing, leaning over the table, his large hands planting firmly on either side of Julian's laptop. The physical proximity instantly shifted the air in the room, making it thick and electric. "Let him bring the military. My men know these streets better than any soldier." "No," Julian countered, looking up into Dante's eyes, refusing to back down from the intense gaze. "If the military steps in, your business model dies. The streets get locked down, supply chains freeze, and your captains lose faith. We don't fight his army. We take away his authorization." Dante raised an eyebrow, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He reached out, his thumb catching Julian's chin, tilting his face upward. "And how does my brilliant strategist plan to stop a United States senator from signing an executive order?" "By exposing the fact that he doesn't have the legal authority to sign anything," Julian murmured, his breath hitching slightly as Dante's thumb stroked his lower lip. 2 years ago, my father suffered a minor stroke. He covered it up, but to ensure he didn't lose his seat, he had his medical board forge his fitness clearances. I have the original neurological scans on an encrypted server in his private residence. If those go public, his emergency declaration is legally void, and his career is over." Dante's eyes darkened with a mixture of professional admiration and pure, unadulterated desire. He leaned down, his lips a breath away from Julian's. "You're asking me to break into a senator's personal estate. The most heavily guarded mansion in the state." "I'm not asking you to break in," Julian whispered, his hands moving to rest against Dante's broad chest, feeling the steady, powerful thud of his heart. "I'm telling you that I am going to walk through the front door. And you're going to be right behind me." The Vance estate was a neoclassical monstrosity nestled in the hills overlooking the city, a monument to corruption built on the backs of exploited taxpayers and broken promises. To the outside world, it was an impenetrable fortress. To Julian, it was the prison where he had spent 18 years learning how to survive a monster. The rain had returned, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the roof of the black luxury sedan idling outside the estate's perimeter gates. Julian sat in the passenger seat, dressed in a flawless, tailored suit that Dante had ordered for him. Next to him, Dante held the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the security booth ahead. "If this goes wrong," Dante said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, lethal tone, "I am going to slaughter every single guard in that house to get you out. Do you understand me, Julian?" Julian turned to look at him, reaching across the console to place his hand over Dante's. The contrast was striking, Julian's pale, elegant fingers against Dante's large, scarred hand. "It won't go wrong. My father's security detail uses a biometric protocol that recognizes my retinal scan and DNA signature. They can't deny me entry without alerting the press that the senator's kidnapped son has returned. Dante turned his hand over, gripping Julian's fingers with a fierce, crushing intensity. He pulled Julian toward him, his eyes burning. I don't like you being back in his house. It smells like a trap. It is a trap, Julian whispered, a cold, brilliant smile touching his lips. But we're the ones snapping it. Julian leaned across the gap, pressing his lips to Dante's in a hard, lingering kiss. It was a silent promise, a contract signed in the dark. Dante groaned softly, his hand moving to the back of Julian's neck, deepening the kiss, claiming him completely before letting him go. 10 minutes, Dante warned, his voice rough. Then I come in with the heavy armor. Julian stepped out of the car into the cold rain, his posture straightening into the rigid, aristocratic bearing of a politician's son. He walked up to the security gate, looking directly into the biometric scanner. A sharp beep echoed through the night. Mr. Vance, the guard's voice crackled through the intercom, sounding utterly stunned. We thought you were. Open the gate, Julian commanded coldly. I'm home. The iron gates groaned open. Julian walked up the long, winding driveway, the mansion looming before him like a mausoleum. He didn't look back to see if Dante was following. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the Mafia boss would never let him fall. Inside the grand foyer, the air was suffocatingly quiet. Standing at the top of the double staircase was Senator Anthony Vance. He looked exactly as Julian remembered, bloated with power, his hair perfectly coiffed, his eyes devoid of any human warmth. Julian, Anthony said, his voice echoing off the marble walls, carrying the practiced, theatrical resonance of a campaign speech. You've caused quite a mess. I suppose I should thank the Romano family for keeping you alive long enough to crawl back to me. I didn't crawl, Father, Julian said, stepping into the center of the foyer, his voice echoing back with equal force. I walked. And I brought the executioner with me. The heavy mahogany front doors burst open behind Julian, and Dante Romano stepped into the light, a silenced pistol in his hand, his eyes locked onto the senator with the lethal precision of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. The grand foyer of the Vance estate became a pressure cooker of absolute silence. Senator Anthony Vance did not flinch at the sight of the silenced pistol in Dante's hand. Instead, his eyes slowly drifted from the barrel of the gun to his son's face, a look of profound, icy disgust hardening his features. A Romano, Anthony sneered, his voice dripping with aristocratic condescension. You always were a disappointment, Julian, but I never imagined you would resort to whoring yourself out to a street thug to get back at me. Dante's jaw tightened, the muscles in his forearm flexing as his finger twitched on the trigger. The temperature in the room plummeted. But before Dante could take a step forward, Julian placed a gentle, steadying hand on the Mafia boss's chest. The physical contact was brief, but it acted like an anchor, pulling Dante back from the edge of lethal violence. Don't let him bait you, Dante, Julian said smoothly, his eyes never leaving his father. He's trying to provoke a shooting because he knows the foyer camera is broadcasting a hardwired backup to a secure cloud server. If you kill him now, you become a martyr for his campaign trail. We are here for the medical files. Anthony's eyes widened slightly, a fraction of a millimeter, but to an expert observer like Julian, it was as loud as a scream. The senator's gaze darted toward the library double doors to the left. Ah, Julian murmured, a cold, elegant smile spreading across his lips. Still kept in the floor safe beneath the liquor cabinet. You really are a creature of habit, Father. You won't leave this house alive, Julian, Anthony hissed, his theatrical political mask slipping entirely to reveal the snarling dictator beneath. The security detail is already deploying from the guest house. You have 60 seconds before this room is flooded with federal contractors. Then we'll have to be quick, Dante rumbled. With a fluid, terrifying burst of speed, Dante stepped forward and brought the butt of his pistol down hard against Anthony's jaw. The senator crumpled to the marble floor with a heavy groan, clutching his bleeding face. Dante didn't spare him a second glance. He grabbed Julian by the arm, pulling him tightly against his side as they sprinted into the library. The safe. How long? 30 seconds if the encryption hasn't changed, Julian said, dropping to his knees behind the mahogany bar and ripping away a section of the Persian rug to reveal a digital keypad. His fingers flew across the panel, entering a complex string of hexadecimal overrides he had memorized years ago. Outside, the faint sound of shouting and heavy boots echoed across the courtyard. The security detail was arriving. Click. The steel lid of the safe popped open. Julian reached inside and pulled out a sleek, unlabeled silver flash drive and a thick manila folder containing the original, unedited neurological scans from the senator's stroke. Got it, Julian breathed, looking up. Dante was already there, pulling Julian to his feet by his waist. The proximity in the dark library was suffocatingly intense. Dante's amber eyes were wild with adrenaline, his breath hot against Julian's cheek. The perimeter is breached. We exit through the conservatory. Move. The escape through the glass-walled conservatory was a blur of shattered glass and automatic gunfire. Dante's private security team had launched a synchronized counter-assault on the front gates, drawing the bulk of the senator's contractors away from the rear of the estate. By the time Julian and Dante breached the tree lane at the edge of the property, they were soaked to the bone, their evening were ruined by mud and rain. They threw themselves into the back of a waiting armored SUV, Marco slamming the door shut behind them and gunning the engine. Julian slumped against the leather seat, his chest heaving, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The silver flash drive was gripped so tightly in his hand that the metal edges cut into his palm. Suddenly, a heavy, warm weight enveloped him. Dante pulled Julian directly into his lap, wrapping his massive arms around the younger man's shivering frame. Julian didn't protest, he buried his face into the crook of Dante's neck, breathing in the scent of rain, gunpowder, and the familiar, grounding cedarwood cologne. You're safe, Dante growled softly, his lips pressing fervently against Julian's wet hair. You did it, sweetheart. We have him. Julian pulled back slightly, looking up into Dante's fierce amber eyes. The raw, possessive love reflecting back at him was terrifying, beautiful, and entirely undeniable. It's not over until the media gets this. If my father tracks this vehicle. He won't, Dante interrupted, his hand rising to cup Julian's cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a streak of dirt. Marco dropped 3 signal scramblers on the way out. Right now, Anthony Vance is watching his entire world dissolve on a broken security feed. Dante's gaze dropped to Julian's mouth, the tension inside the roaring vehicle shifting instantly from survival to an intoxicating, magnetic hunger. I told you I would make you my king, Julian, Dante whispered, his voice a low, seductive promise that vibrated through Julian's entire body. I meant it. This city is ours now. Show me, Julian breathed. Dante leaned down and captured Julian's lips in a deep, possessive kiss that wiped out the remaining cold of the rain. It was a victory, a coronation, and a surrender all at once. Julian's fingers tangled into Dante's damp hair, pulling the Mafia boss closer, completely yielding to the dark, fiercely loyal empire they were building together in the shadows. As the SUV sped away into the neon-lit city streets, Julian knew the Vance dynasty was dead. In its place, a new court had risen, and he was exactly where he belonged. The morning after the infiltration, the city woke up to a political apocalypse. The neurological scans, along with a meticulously organized ledger detailing the Genesis Foundation's multi-million-dollar bribery network, had been leaked simultaneously to 40 different news outlets. By 8 a.m., federal agents were executing search warrants at the state capitol. By 9 a.m., Senator Anthony Vance's own party had publicly stripped him of his committee assignments and demanded his immediate resignation. Inside the penthouse of the Romano compound, the chaos of the outside world felt a million miles away. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the morning mist rise off the river. He was wrapped in a plush, dark silk robe that smelled faintly of Dante. In his hand, he held a porcelain cup of black coffee, though he hadn't taken a sip. The adrenaline that had sustained him for a week had finally evaporated, leaving behind a profound, unfamiliar stillness. For the first time in his 25 years, he didn't have to look over his shoulder. A pair of strong, scarred arms wrapped around his waist from behind, pulling him back against a broad, solid chest. Dante pressed a soft kiss to the side of Julian's neck, his morning stubble scraping pleasantly against Julian's skin. "You're thinking too loud, strategist," Dante murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a wave of warmth through Julian's body. "The empire is broken. The throne is empty. You won." "We won," Julian corrected softly, leaning his head back against Dante's shoulder. He turned slightly within Dante's embrace, looking up at the Mafia boss. "But vacuum periods are dangerous. My father's old allies are going to scramble to protect themselves. They'll try to consolidate power under a new figurehead." Dante smiled, a dark, incredibly handsome expression that made Julian's heart skip a beat. He took the coffee cup from Julian's hand and set it on a nearby table, then cupped Julian's face with both hands. "Let them try," Dante whispered, his amber eyes burning with absolute devotion. "My captains have already seized the North Harbor shipping lanes permanently. The city council is falling into line. There is no new figurehead, Julian. There is only us." Julian reached up, his fingers tracing the sharp line of Dante's jaw. The sheer intensity of the man's affection was still overwhelming, a stark contrast to the transactional cruelty Julian had known all his life. "You really mean it? You're making me your partner?" "I don't make deals I don't intend to keep," Dante said, his voice dropping to a fierce, possessive register. "You gave me the keys to the kingdom, sweetheart. The least I can do is make sure you wear the crown." He leaned down, capturing Julian's lips in a slow, deeply tender kiss that tasted of morning warmth and absolute certainty. Julian sighed into the kiss, his arms wrapping tightly around Dante's neck, completely anchoring himself to the new reality they had forged. 2 months later, the dust had officially settled. Anthony Vance was residing in a federal medical detention facility, awaiting trial for treason, fraud, and a litany of racketeering charges. The Vance name was a stain on the city's history, but Julian didn't care. He had officially legally dropped his surname, choosing to go simply by Julian. The grand ballroom of the Romano estate was filled with the city's true elite, not the politicians who pretended to rule, but the syndicate captains, the union leaders, and the shadow financiers who actually kept the wheels turning. It was a coronation masquerading as a charity gala. Julian stood at the top of the grand staircase, dressed in a midnight blue bespoke tuxedo. His hair was perfectly styled, his bearing regal and flawless. He looked down at the crowd, no longer a captive strategist, but the undisputed architect of the city's new regime. Dante stepped up beside him, looking breathtakingly powerful in a classic black tuxedo. He didn't look at the crowd below, his eyes were fixed entirely on Julian. "Ready, my king?" Dante asked softly, offering his arm. Julian looked at Dante, a genuine, brilliant smile illuminating his face. The fear, the trauma, and the cold calculations of his past were gone, replaced by a fierce, burning passion for the man standing next to him. "Always," Julian whispered, sliding his hand into the crook of Dante's arm. As they walked down the stairs together, the crowd parted in absolute reverence. They had started as kidnapper and hostage, a brutal clash of two different worlds. But in the dark space between survival and revenge, they had found something entirely unbreakable. They hadn't just dismantled an empire, they had built a dynasty of their own.
Thank you for watching, dear darlings. Don't forget to like and subscribe the channel for more such story.